Okay, welcome everyone. Good afternoon if you're in New York. Good evening, good morning if you're someplace else in the world. Thank you so much for joining us for the very first workshop in our MA Academic and Professional Development series on how to choose a thesis topic. And we're very excited to be joined today by four master's program directors and faculty from Columbia. We have Denise Milstein, who's the MA program director from Sociology. Lara Nettelfield, who's a senior lecturer at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights and is also active with the MA program in Human Rights. Rebecca Feinberg, MA academic coordinator in the program in Global Thought. And Brian Boyd, lecturer and director of Museum Anthropology of that master's program. So thanks so much to all of you. And I'm actually just gonna go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you for the opportunity to do this workshop. So welcome, everyone. We're here to share some of our ideas about how to choose a research topic. I think it's important to say from the beginning that we're all coming from different disciplines, and we recognize that all of you are coming from different disciplines. So I think that what we say will be useful to you, but you should translate it in your minds to what's appropriate for whatever discipline you're coming from. The advice that we give today and the experiences that we share should be considered together with what faculty members in your department are recommending. I'm gonna give you just a brief overview of what we're gonna talk about today. We're going to share our stories of trial and error. We're gonna talk about what is a thesis. We're going to discuss what is a case. We're going to talk a little bit about the process of going back and forth between theoretical and substantive interests and different types of questions and how to figure out what kind of question you're asking and what kind of puzzle you're working on. We'll discuss methods for a bit. We're actually going to talk about the pandemic situation and what it means to your research, both in terms of some of the limitations that you might encounter and some of the new possibilities that the pandemic offers, surprisingly enough, in the context of research. And then we're going to do a brief exercise where we put you in small groups to talk about your own work. And once we're done with that, we're going to open it up to questions and answers. I want to start talking about trials and errors, and I think I'll turn it over to one of my colleagues and so that you can hear another voice for a little bit. And we'll just quickly go through what we've encountered as researchers. So maybe Lara, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you for that introduction, Rachel and Denise. So I'm based at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights, and I'm the Director of Graduate Studies for the MA in Human Rights Studies program. And my first large research project, which was for my PhD, which I did here in the Department of Political Science, was a study of the attitudes and the impact of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And I was looking at the case study of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So the larger research question in my dissertation project was, do transitional justice mechanisms, that is courts and truth and reconciliation commissions and the like, aid transitions to democracy? And this was a so-called mixed methods research project where I conducted surveys, I did ethnographic research, I went to archives, I conducted oral histories. I had the benefit of grants that allowed me to spend a long time in the field. But inevitably, when you get to the field and you start cold calling people for interviews, or you show up at that NGO you're dying to study, things don't go as planned. So I just wanted to mention a few examples. And I can't emphasize the need for patience, good humor, and kind of the ability to figure out how to pivot in the face of these obstacles and challenges. But with the data that you do get, you'll usually be able to answer your research question. So first, by the time I went to the field, I had narrowed my topic from one that planned on looking at 3 different countries, which no one funded the first year I applied for grants, to one that looked at 1 country and was much more focused. And that's very common at the initial stage of coming up with a research topic of any sort. Students start with overly broad topics and they need to be whittled away. So if you are in that stage, do not despair. Now, I was looking at the impact of the court in different segments of the population, in the military and among survivor groups, and one chapter looked at the NGO sector. So I was repeating a study of the attitudes of 55 NGO leaders about their attitudes towards the criminal tribunal. And the first study of its kind had been done 5 years prior, and I was lucky to be able to repeat that study, which gave me sort of what they call quasi-panel data, to be able to measure how attitudes had changed over time. So I had created a database of all of the NGOs in the country. There were about 1,400 at the time, and I got up at 5 a.m. often to take the bus all over the country to interview all of these NGO heads. But I remember one NGO in a small town called Stolac did not want to speak with a foreign researcher, but they didn't tell me that in advance. They waited until I took the 2.5-hour bus ride, and I took it 3 different times hoping to catch an interview because they were on my list and it was a random sample and you have to interview the people on your list. So they never showed up. I had to go back and take a second sample. I had to go back to the statistician I was working with, and it was just a scenario I hadn't planned for. But then sometimes spending time in the field and just patience will pay off. I did a lot of research with the mothers of Srebrenica, the survivors of the 1995 genocide, and I traveled with them to The Hague. I took a 30-hour bus ride with them as they were presenting their case against the United Nations for reparations. I went to mass grave exhumations with them, conferences they organized, and one of the highlights was traveling with 50 orphans from the municipality of Srebrenica to the city of Old Sin in Montenegro, where generous businessmen in that small town had invited the orphans, all of whom had never been to the sea before, to open the tourist season. So by kind of what my colleague calls deep hanging out, or this continued ethnographic research, I was able to develop a relationship with them and to realize the role that the court had played in their activism. So I would just say that patience and flexibility matter, humility matters, and that you need to be ready to pivot when things don't go as planned. And it's okay if they don't go as planned, because they usually don't. It's totally fine. I'll hand back to Denise.
Thanks so much, Lara. Maybe we can continue with Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. I will keep my trial and error story brief because I will tell a longer one later. But I absolutely second Lara's emphasis on patience and flexibility and pivoting, in that even with the best of plans, especially when you are doing research that depends on other people, there are going to be some bumps in the road. And I was thinking about the time in which I had 1 week in the city of Torino in Italy to do all of my archival work. And I had figured out which institutions I wanted to visit in the city. I'd found their opening hours. I showed up right when they opened on Monday morning. Finally, spent hours combing through their database system, figuring out which boxes I needed to access. And finally went up to the desk to present this list of boxes. And the staff took a look at it and said, okay, come back next week. Like, what? So that was, the processing time was not what I had expected. And so it worked out. I found a time to come back later in my research. I found other forms of historical research I could use. But it's all to say that when you're thinking about how you're going to do your research or what kind of data you're going to rely on, it's best if you don't have all of your eggs in one time-specific basket, because you never know what's going to happen. And a more diverse data set will make for richer research. So you always want to diversify where you're getting your information from, who you're talking to, what institutions you're interested in, both for practical purposes, but also for more robust research. And let's hear from Brian.
Brian, I think you're muted.
Thank you. I've only been teaching all morning. I should know how this works. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Brian Boyd from Anthropology. Yeah, obviously, I'll completely agree with being open, expect the unexpected. Coming from a social science, we're dealing with people all the time, and people are unpredictable. And one thing that came to mind when I was listening to what Rebecca and Lara were saying, some of my early experiences in doing research. I'm an archaeologist, actually, work in prehistory in the Middle East. And inevitably, you're relying a lot on your data being held by other academics, usually academics that are way more senior than you. And one thing to realize is that you have to get permissions for a lot of things in advance. And also academics, especially, I don't know what it's like in other disciplines, but anthropologists and archaeologists are notoriously territorial and proprietorial about their data or their field sites and things like that. And as students starting out in that, we often think we can just walk in and get involved in a project and have our opinions listened to on an equal footing with people who are more experienced than us. And of course, I found out very quickly that that was not the case. I took a long time to get necessary permissions and to have my ideas and opinions listened to, let alone acted upon. So it's quite a humbling experience in many ways, but that humility should stay with you, I think, and hopefully it makes us better academics at the end of the day. But also on the practical side of things, I think you have to be very organized, and especially if you're doing a master's thesis, in terms of your time management, because you feel you've got all this time stretching out ahead of you, but it goes very, very quickly. And I mean, just to give one example, when I was doing my PhD research in the early 90s, I was doing a lot of sort of theoretical library work and things like that, but I was also doing some lab work. I'm not a scientist, but I was doing a lot of microscope work, looking at animal bones and things like that. And one thing that I didn't factor in was that I can only spend about 20 minutes to half an hour at a time looking down a microscope. I had all this material to look at, and I thought, right, this will take me 6 months. It actually took me 2 years, because I didn't realize that after an hour looking down a microscope, you start getting a headache, and the lights aren't conducive to long periods of time. So things always take much, much, much longer than you might initially envisage. That was my experience anyway. So I think time management is really important. And it's difficult to get a handle on that right at the beginning of choosing a project, but it's important because you're relying a lot on other people, you're relying on a lot of external factors that you don't really have any control over. So try and give yourself more time than you might initially expect. I made a lot of mistakes like that in the early days that in retrospect, I could have done better. So those were my kind of trials and errors, really, mostly over time management and expecting people to be more accommodating and more flexible, maybe. So that's, I've got more to say when it comes to actually talking about the thesis itself, but that's for the moment, that's my ideas. So.
Thank you so much for that, Brian. And I'll say that I agree with every single thing that Lara and Rebecca and Brian have shared. I'm a sociologist and I work on all kinds of different things. One brief story that I can tell is behind the photograph that you're seeing here in this presentation. So it's actually a photograph of my PhD dissertation, or a printout of my PhD dissertation, which was about authoritarianism in Latin America. I was looking at the trajectories of musicians, in particular musicians in Brazil and in Uruguay during the 1960s and 1970s, when dictatorships were installed in both countries. And I was trying to understand the ways in which the kind of repression that these musicians were facing impacted their voices. And I was especially interested in looking at how innovation was arising in a highly structured context. It was a PhD dissertation, so it wasn't a brilliant work, but it gave me space to think about issues that were really important to me, both theoretically in terms of just my interests as a sociologist, but also personally. And so that happened many years ago, and a few years later, my work shifted a little bit, and I started collaborating with a group of artists and scientists who were focusing on Tierra del Fuego, which is a region on the very southern tip of South America that's shared between Chile and Argentina. And we were trying to understand the history of the place, and trying to understand, among other things, the political history and what had happened there. So Tierra del Fuego is a very complicated place. It's difficult for human beings to live there. And when it was first settled by Europeans, had a lot of indigenous communities that actually had figured out a way to live in balance with that environment. As soon as all of these Europeans started pouring in, they pretty brutally destroyed the indigenous communities that were in place there. And that happened for the most part in the 19th century and early 20th century in Tierra del Fuego. But later on, in the 1970s, during a military dictatorship the Chilean military dictatorship, of which Augusto Pinochet was the leader, the region of Tierra del Fuego was used to house political prisoners. And so I ended up traveling to Tierra del Fuego, and I decided to take my dissertation with me because I was really interested in doing something with it. I thought that maybe it would inform my perspective as I walked around Tierra del Fuego and thought about the history. And we ended up staying in a house on this island called Isla Grande, right on the edge of the Strait of Magellan, which is the water that you see right there in the picture. And across the way from the island where we were staying was this other island called Isla Dawson, which was a place where there was a pretty large prisoner settlement, or prisoner camp, you might call it. And it was incredibly disturbing to be there and to be across the way from this island and to think about what had happened on this island in this prisoner camp. And I guess this story is less about research and more about what happens with research once you've finished it. But I kept looking at my dissertation and I didn't really know what to do with it. And then I remembered Marcel Duchamp, who was an artist who used to make ready-mades. The most famous one is of a urinal, and you've either seen it in a museum or you've seen photographs of it. But there's also a fairly well-known ready-made, which is of a geometry book that he gave to his sister when she got married. and with very strict directions about what she should do with it. He asked her to put it outside, to hang it up, and to let the weather turn the pages of her geometry, of that geometry book. And so I decided to make a ready-made with my dissertation, which might seem like a very strange thing to all of you, but it was interesting to hang up my dissertation and to see it over the course of a few hours turn into what you see in this picture. And you might all be asking at this point, what does this have to do with social science, right? But it was the beginning of a new project for me. It was the beginning of a new project about the role of social science really in trying to understand historical and political trauma in Latin America. And so it opened the way for me to do something completely new, which is to say, you might take what you do here at Columbia this year and use it to open the way to do something completely new. Or you might take something that you've already done as an undergraduate, for example, in which you thought you would continue here at Columbia and realize that it needs to be used in a different way, to turn in a new direction. And so I guess what I'm trying to convey in my story is that it's possible when engaging in a new project to really think outside of the box, and to allow yourself to explore things, and to also use data, and to use even secondary literature in different ways. I don't necessarily advise you to take books and hang them up outside, but it's just an image that maybe will help you to realize that there's a lot of different things that you can do with words on paper beyond what you might imagine right now. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian, who's going to talk much more concretely about what is a thesis. And I'm going to change the slide. There we go.
Okay, thank you, Denise. Wow, what an interesting variety of experiences there. Yeah, if that was my thesis, it would be in the sea, never mind hanging from a bush, you know, a fence. Okay, so we want to address this topic here. What is a thesis? Now, obviously, as has been mentioned already, we've got a broad diversity or variety of disciplines in the audience today. So hopefully we can find some common ground to address this question. So we've got some subheadings here: length of thesis, literature review, original research, and argument. So what is a thesis? Well, let's start with the final category here, argument. The idea of a thesis is to present your material, but in the framework of a critical argument or critical review, depending on your discipline or subdiscipline. If we have students here from maybe that are more leaning towards the sciences, your thesis will be based upon maybe a traditional kind of hypothesis testing, experimentation and results. If you're in the social sciences or the humanities, your thesis may be more along the lines of evaluating different arguments that already exist in the literature, and introducing your own original data and ideas and theoretical perspectives as your kind of original take on the question. So there's a whole range of different things a thesis can be. Of course, these days, we're not simply talking about a written text. I had a thesis just last year, which was a video project and a sound project. So there's some flexibility in there outside the traditional boundaries of the written text. But the idea is obviously to present in a critical manner an evaluation of the currently existing body of knowledge on any particular topic and to have your take on it. That's your original research. What's your take on this? And obviously your literature review will display your knowledge of the current literature and to show to your readers that you have a certain command of the existing state of the subject or the topic as it exists at the moment. But then the most important thing is your contribution to this. What are you bringing to this field that either hasn't already been said or is a new way of saying it, as Denise was saying? What are you bringing to the table that is your contribution to the existing body of knowledge on this particular topic? And I think that is one of the common threads anyway. So to show a command of the current field and what is your contribution to that current field. And I think that's a kind of common area that we can agree on, I think, that crosses the disciplines in terms of your own ideas and things like that. Now, I find that students are often concerned about, in my field of museum anthropology, the first question that students tend to ask is, what's the length of the thesis? This kind of thing. And of course, again, that differs from subject to subject. Maybe we can get some opinion on that. What do you recommend to your students in terms of length of thesis? Because page count and word count often seems to be a concern for students. I don't worry too much about it personally, but that's something we can get some opinion on perhaps. Similarly, students always ask, should I have a literature review? And again, that depends on the topic, depends on your discipline. Sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes to have a lengthy literature review, which is more like a critical review, maybe an annotated review of existing literature or the main points that you're going to use. And the other thing that students ask a lot is, can I see existing or past student theses on this topic? So as for anthropology, we have a library in our department where where past theses are held, actual physical copies of them. We have them online too, so students can actually go and visit and consult. And I actually have a couple of sessions with my group, my cohort, where we actually sit and go through the physical copies. This is what it looks like. How is it structured? And it displays the diversity of approaches that are available to you and things like that. So it's always a good thing, I think, to go and look at previous students' theses in your particular department or in your research area, things like that. Of course, there's always a concern with originality, as I've said. What counts as, what constitutes original research? Your questions don't have to be questions that have never been asked before, or you can certainly add to the body of knowledge, but it's your theoretical perspective, your take on it, if you like, and we'll talk about that as we go through the session today. That's important. Similarly, your argument is the original research and the argument are so intertwined, they're difficult to separate out here. So maybe we can have some sort of questions and discussion about what counts as original research, and how do our arguments or ideas about a particular body of data, how can we make these articulate with an idea of originality or original research? So that's just some general points that we can maybe carry forward into the discussions. And if you have questions on any of these, we can address them, obviously. Is that okay if anyone wants to jump in there with anything in addition to that?
I think this outlines the approach in a lot of our departments. I want to encourage people, as you listen to us, to write questions in the chat if you don't want to jump in right now with questions, and we're going to have a question and answer period at the end, so you can mull this over as we talk about all kinds of different things. and we can return to the question of what is a thesis later on as well. But are there any immediate questions right now? Okay, so maybe we'll move on to the next slide, which is what is a case? And Lara is going to talk a little bit about roadkill and potholes.
Denise. Quickly, I just wanted to mention something that was relayed to me by one of my early PhD advisors, who's now a trustee at Barnard, Steve Solnick. And when picking your topic, he argues that your topic will either be a pothole or a roadkill case. Now, a roadkill topic is a topic, well, roadkill in general, people crowd around roadkill, circling the area, gawking. So a roadkill topic is something that a lot of people are interested in at the same time. So an example in my field of a roadkill topic might be the so-called European refugee crisis. A pothole topic, potholes are things that people drive over and say, whoa, why hasn't somebody fixed that? So in the case of a thesis topic, it would be the question of why hasn't someone yet investigated that? In the field of human rights, we get a lot of pothole topics because people want to look at current issues and things that haven't been researched before. And in these cases, they'll often borrow from older analytical frameworks and utilize newer empirical data. Now, depending upon your topic and your chosen methodology, which Rebecca is going to discuss, the literature may tend towards certain kinds of arguments. In the field of human rights, there's a great article by Emily Hafner-Burton and James Rahn that looks at the question of international human rights instruments and argues about whether or not they consistently can produce positive results. And they find a divide, and they find that the more qualitative kind of interview-based research tends to find positive results for human rights institutions and instruments, and that more quantitative or statistical research tends towards more skeptical outcomes. So you may or may not have a similar divide in your own fields, but I just wanted to flag that. That's it. Potholes versus roadkill.
Denise, you're muted still.
I have unmuted myself. Sorry about that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways in which theoretical interests relate to substantive interests. A lot of you start out with a substantive interest. So there's a world that you're interested in exploring, either because you have personal experience with it or because you've been interested in it for a very long time and have been reading about it, or for all kinds of other reasons. Some substantive interests often come into our lives serendipitously. So I think it's worth really being open to different kinds of possibilities. I, for example, was not particularly interested in public health. I had never done work in public health before, but when the pandemic came along, I ended up starting a project with a friend who specializes in studies of risk management and who was really interested in collaborating with me because of my experience doing qualitative research. And so now, as of about 6 months ago, I'm a person who studies public health. And you could say that I came serendipitously into that field. But my previous work on art and politics was really, there's an extent to which it had to do with things that I was already interested in, especially music. But actually, there was an underlying theoretical interest that was driving me. I really, really wanted to understand the ways in which innovation arises out of extremely structured situations. And repression, political repression of artists seemed like an ideal sort of case for trying to understand that. So it may be that you're coming into this with a theoretical interest. You want to understand innovation, or you want to understand the structure or the dynamics of history, or you want to understand the relationship between structure and agency. It could be all kinds of different things. And it could also be that you're starting out with a really concrete substantive interest. But once you go into the field, you end up actually going back and forth between your substantive interest and your theoretical interest. So in the master's program in sociology, which I run, the first month of the semester, I have the students do 4 assignments, and they're not happy about this usually, to have 4 assignments in the first 4 weeks of the semester, but they're brief assignments and they're very low stakes, and we don't really grade them. But the assignments ask them to go out into the field, which could mean looking at documents in an archive, or going to a park to observe people's interactions with each other, or doing a couple of informational interviews with potential participants in a research study, and to do some field work, and then to write 500 to 1,000 words about their experience with field work. Then the next week, we ask them to go into the library website and find literature within the discipline of sociology or adjacent disciplines by people who were asking similar questions, who were asking questions related to whatever question was being addressed in the first fieldwork assignment. Then the third week, we send students out into the field again, and they can choose to go to the same place, or they can go somewhere new and make observations. And then the fourth week, we force them back into the library website to gather literature that will support their work, but that will also give them a sense of what people have done and what people have not done in their field. So what's the point of this exercise? The point of this exercise is actually creating a sort of habit of going back and forth, and this is why I'm showing you the pendulum here. It's creating a sort of pendular movement between theoretical and substantive interests, because that's actually the way to gain traction in your field and to go beyond doing work that's purely descriptive. I think if you go into a field and start observing things, you can derive a lot of descriptions of what it is that you're observing. So going from the descriptive to the analytical, right? So when you go back and start reading, and sometimes it's surprising because you can find readings that don't seem really related to what you're interested in, but that help you to start forging a critical perspective, or a kind of research question that's going to ask something more than what, where, when. That's going to push you in the direction of how and why. The last thing I'll say here is that if you look at this pendulum, you can see that the maximum kinetic energy is right in the middle, right? And there's a lot of potential energy when you're in the field, and a lot of potential energy when you're looking at the literature and thinking more theoretically. It's actually in the movement that you have the most energy, and it's in that movement that you're going to find a place to really start thinking critically, develop a viable research question, and then eventually start writing about what it is that you researched. So that's what I have to say about that. I'm gonna move on to Lara and Brian talking a little bit about questions.
Do you want me to start?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Denise, for that overview. Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize what Denise has just told you. The writer Adam Gopnik, who writes for The New Yorker, said to tell a story about the world, you have to tell a story about a world. So when you're narrowing down your topic, it is useful to go back and forth and keep in mind those big picture questions. I'm I'm trained as a political scientist, as I mentioned, and as an oral historian. And in human rights, which is an interdisciplinary field, we draw on and utilize texts from many different areas: political science, history, law, anthropology. And in poli-sci and across the social sciences, some of the big picture questions we're interested in are, like, why do people commit crimes? How do we get them to stop doing so? Do institutions constrain behavior? Or if you're looking at the question of accountability, as we often are in the field of human rights, the question of, do we remember or do we forget, is always a subject of interest, and what are the consequences of each decision? So in human rights, a lot of the scholarship is also dedicated to measuring the efficacy of specific institutions and initiatives. So a specific UN mission, a specific social welfare program, or a specific advocacy campaign. And your research question in general, and only recently have we started paying close attention to the methods that we use. And in the field over the last 10 years, we've really have been focusing on how we collect data and the methods, because the legal field was dominant first, and now the social scientists have been working in the field. So your research question should be researchable, something that you can answer, and you need to be able to access the data. And it also needs to be doable within the time frame allotted. And the justifications for the project are that it usually addresses a real world problem or a gap in the literature and somehow. But you also need to answer the so what question, like, why is your topic important? What's at stake here? Why is your topic significant? And how is it original? And some academics in political science emphasize the need to look for puzzles, things that are crying out to be explained. So my advisor in the poli-sci department used to say, you want to look at man bites dog and not dog bites man. So there's an article which I will put in the chat by Carl Gustafsson and Lingus Hagström, and they propose that research puzzles ask the following questions. And this is similar to the exercise we'll do in a while. Why X despite Y? Or how did X become possible despite Y? And this formulation, they argue, requires that you be familiar with your subject area. And they argue that a research puzzle is a question or paradox about causation or the consequences of a particular phenomenon, and that a good puzzle is both theoretically and empirically interesting. So puzzles, I'm going to put that in the chat. Now there's two different kinds of questions. So there are why questions and there are how questions. And why questions lend themselves towards arguments and explanations that evaluate competing explanatory variables. So for example, at one point, a lot of academics were writing books about the fall of the Soviet Union and why the Soviet Union fell apart. Was it defense spending? Was it factors internal to the Communist Party? So why questions explain a particular outcome and evaluate between these competing explanations. And then there are how questions, and how questions help us understand something. How questions help us understand, in my field of human rights, how people understand institutions, or how maybe they co-opt human rights norms and ideas and use them for their own goals. And these studies often include ethnographic works that provide accounts of meanings that people assign to things and how they interpret events. Some projects look at both, but typically your research question will land on the how on one or the other, or have more emphasis on one or the other. So I'll end there.
Could I just add a couple of little things to that? That's, I mean, you've really covered a lot of important stuff there. I've found that a big concern of many students is, and this is something we've said a couple of times already, answering the question. You know, obviously, you know, when students come to us with a thesis topic, we say, well, what are your research questions? Or what is your research question? And there seems to be an awful lot of concern about answering that question. Because obviously a thesis is a process, it's a research process. And I wouldn't get too caught up on when you come to write your conclusions to your thesis, about actually tying all the loose ends up and answering conclusively your question. Because, you know, to do any social science or humanity, you know, or anything to do with humanity, obviously, questions are contingent and open-ended and often inconclusive. So don't worry too much about you know, tying up all the loose ends, as I say. You can leave things open-ended. You can leave things for future research, for example. And that also goes for accumulating your data. You know, you might have too much data for the questions. You know, I often give advice to my PhD students when they say, where should I put this? Where should I put this? How you know, in the thesis? And I say, well, no, you've got to keep focused for your thesis. Why don't you have a folder on your desktop that says postdoc? And when you've got material that doesn't directly address your question, take it and drop it into that postdoc folder for future research. And if you're doing a master's thesis, you could drop it into a folder saying PhD or future publications or something like that. You know, you don't have to thoroughly answer a question as long as you address it thoroughly, and you can still leave it open-ended and still have an interesting series of arguments. You can still have an interesting and valuable contribution to that research area without necessarily answering the question in a traditional sense of answering. So I just wanted to add that in there as well, if that's okay.
Absolutely, Brian. I just wanted to add that, yeah, I had a student I was speaking with this week, and the person didn't get their desired outcome, both in their interviews and their conclusions. And I was trying to explain that, you know, if you don't confirm your hypothesis, that's a finding too, and that's an important finding.
Exactly, yeah.
Look at all the vaccine trials that are going on right now, which aren't going to work. Those are extremely important exercises. So just because you don't get your intended outcome, or you have to pivot and rewrite your research question midstream, that's okay too. It's all good.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you, for all of those insights. I'm actually learning too from listening to you, which is wonderful. I think we're going to move on to talking a little bit about methods, and Rebecca is going to address this. We have just a couple more slides before we send you off into groups to talk about your own projects.
Thank you, Denise. So methods, we spend all of this time agonizing over, you know, what question should I ask? What's the theoretical underpinning? How am I going to, you know, construct this? But it is just as important to think about how you're actually going to do that research, right? So your methods will inform both the questions that you can ask and how you can go about answering them. And fundamentally, whatever you're going to research, it has to be something that you can actually do. So that's both in terms of access, but also in scope, right? The project that you can take on for a 9-month master's program or even a 2-year master's program is very different than what you would design for a PhD or for a book, right? So we have to find scale. Then you have to think also about things like time and funding, right? How much, so not just how much time do you have for your master's program, but how much time you have to devote to research, if you have other courses or teaching obligations, if you will need funding to do the kind of research you have in mind and where that's going to come from. You want to think about training and skills, whether those are linguistic or technical or computational, laboratory techniques, right? Are you ready to do the kind of research that you're proposing? And then, as we talked about earlier today, there are all sorts of issues around access or reliability that may shape what is doable. So that may include clearance or access to facilities, and especially for those of us in the social sciences, the unreliability of other human beings. Lastly, any kind of research that involves human research subjects may need institutional review board clearance, IRB in other words, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So as your research matures and you get this tree of questions that's growing out of the central trunk that you started with, you will likely need new kinds of information, whether that's historical context, firsthand accounts, official statistics, newspaper archives, chemical analyses, whatever it is you need to do your project. And you may not be able to conduct all of this yourself. You may not be able to outsource it. And that will really help you shape the directions your project can go and the claims that you can make. So it's okay if you can't answer every single subset of your original question. You should focus on the data that is available to you and the methods that are going to be most realistic and effective for you to pursue. So you can't obviously anticipate all of those directions from the get-go, but you do need to have a realistic plan for how you're going to get the data that you know you'll need now at the outset. So you'll want to think about, first of all, how are you going to access or generate that data? How are you going to record that data? And then once you have it, how are you going to analyze it? Methods is not just creating or gathering up data, it's actually what you do with it and how that allows you to make a claim. So thinking about this should be part of evaluating any potential research question. And definitely not things that you only think about once you're like 6 months into building a lit review, right? Think about this at the outset and you'll be a much happier human for the next year or two. And these questions also need to take into account this year how pandemic conditions for some projects reconfigure a lot of access. That's going to be different for each location, for each community, for each kind of project. But it is something that you want to think differently and carefully about this year. And we'll come back to that in a minute with Denise. For now, I want to return to IRB. And Columbia's IRB governs human research subjects. Human research subjects imply often all kinds of ethical concerns or dangers in doing research poorly or without consideration for people's dignity or privacy or safety. And there is a long history of, unfortunately, abusing all of those things in US research history, which is why the Institutional Review Board is a thing, and why as researchers, we make sure that we receive clearance from them before proceeding with any human subjects research project. Not everyone has to complete an IRB protocol, but for projects that engage with particular populations in particular ways, those do require a very detailed protocol for exactly how you will identify, engage with, and record the data about the people with whom you're working. In order to submit and have one of those protocols approved, you need faculty supervision, you need perseverance because it will probably not be approved on the first round, and you need time. This can take months to get approved. So if you know that you're going to be working with a population or asking the kinds of questions that requires IRB clearance, and you can consult with your faculty advisors to help determine that, it is essential that you give yourself time and make sure that you have a faculty member who is willing to guide you through that process and sign off on your protocol. And again, pandemic life means that there are likely new stricter rules because there are new kinds of risk for in-person human subjects research. So you'll need to build a research plan that is resilient, that can withstand changes in mobility or access or safety in the months and year ahead. So Denise, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. I'm going to continue from some of the excellent points that Rebecca made about doing research in the context of the pandemic, or moving more specifically to talking about what happens with the pandemic. And I'm saying this with the understanding that you are all in different parts of the world. We have several Chinese students in our program this year who tell me that the situation in China is completely different from the situation in New York City. Restrictions are much more lax in China right now because they have successfully controlled the virus, or at least have it more or less under control at the moment. And so it's important to think about your research in your present context, with the understanding that your present context might change, right? So right now in New York City, things are looking all right, but within 2 or 3 weeks, the situation could change, which means that you really need to be prepared for different kinds of possibilities. One possibility is that if you're counting on in-person interactions, you might lose access to those in-person interactions. And this is precisely what happened to our students last spring. So when New York came under lockdown in mid-March, all of a sudden, our students lost access to their field sites. So it's important to find a way to develop a field site, or to develop a research approach where you can very easily shift into online interactions. If you're doing archival research, it's important to find an archive that you can access online, so that you don't purely depend on going to a library and being able to sit down and look at documents directly. I'm going to share some links with you in the chat. It's 3 different links, and I'm just going to share them all together right now, but you'll see that they take you to different places, and they all relate to a couple of points that I'm going to make here. So let me find the chat and add these links. Here we go. I hope they've all gone through. So the first link, and can you tell me if you actually see this on your screen? Did it go to the link, or are you still in the slideshow?
I see the link.
It did go to the link.
Yes.
Okay, so this is a set of resources that was put together by a group of faculty and graduate students about just doing field work in the pandemic. It's specifically oriented to sociology, but I think is relevant to a lot of different social science disciplines. And it goes into all of the different ways in which you can collect data without having to go into direct contact with people, and without exposing people to the kinds of risks that they might be exposed to in the situation of the pandemic. And so I'm just going down this slowly, and I'm not going to go over every point here, obviously, but some of these links I'm sure will be relevant to many of you. Are you interested in studying Europe? Well, here's a link to different resources for studying Europe online. Are you interested in using digital methods that combine qualitative and quantitative analysis? Well, here are some resources for you on that. Do you want to use photos and videos and voice online? Well, here's a resource for that as well. So I find this to be just a really, really excellent list. Another resource that I wanted to share with you was put together by a workshop at Harvard, and I hope you're all seeing it here. Yes, good. Contemporary Ethnography and Inequality workshop. And it has some things that are less relevant to you, like institutional review guidelines and responses for all of these universities, which are not your university. But actually, the third link that I shared with you has exactly that information specific for Columbia. COVID-19 funding opportunities, maybe not important to you right now, but in this third point here, a crowdsourced online resource is the one that I shared with you earlier. And then what you have here is just examples of ethnographies that are already being carried out under the pandemic. And so this will help you at least get a sense of the kinds of things that people are actually able to do in this context. And it's really amazing. And I know that I said this earlier, the ways in which the pandemic presents opportunities for research that didn't really exist before. And this maybe goes back to my interest in how innovation arises out of highly structured circumstances, but it really is the case that at least for me in my research, I was forced to start doing interviews with people on Zoom. I would have never, ever tried to do that before, but I've learned a new way of communicating, and it's allowed me to do things that I never did before, like, for example, see the homes of the people that I'm interviewing, right? Or see the pets of the people I'm interviewing in some instances, because cats really like to walk across computer keyboards, it seems. So I wanted to share those resources with you, and just to say, in a more sort of structured way, you need to prepare for your in-person interactions to transform into online interactions. That might mean that you start out actually with online interactions, that's the basis of your work, and you have the hopes that you'll be able to have in-person interactions, and you will do it if you can, but if you can't, you have a backup plan. You have to prepare for institutional access, and that means making sure that the institutions give you access to digital data sources. You have to prepare for the possibility that you will not be able to travel, and figure out either ways of focusing on resources that are available to you where you are in this moment, or once again, getting access to archives that allow you to travel, at least virtually. And finally, you have to think about risk, health, and safety. And the hyperlink here goes to the third link that I shared with you, which is an FAQ of the Columbia IRB. A lot of the questions that might be going through your head right now are probably answered there. One possibility to think about, which I think is becoming more common in this context, is collaborative research. You have access to other people who are studying similar things. It might be even that within your cohort, you have colleagues who are doing work that in some way complements your own work. Can you activate those networks in order to get more access? Can you activate those networks in order to find more respondents, in order to carry out more interviews? Can you come up with a set of interview questions that will be useful not just to you, but to 2 or 3 people within your program? And then can you share those resources with each other? These are all possibilities worth exploring in a context where our access to data sources is limited by the pandemic. Okay, so I think Rebecca is going to talk a little bit about sticking to a topic and paying attention. And I see that it's 2:06, so we really don't have a whole lot of time, which means we'll move into our exercise where people share their ideas with each other briefly after that, and then return for a question and answer period with everyone on the panel. So Rebecca, go ahead.
Thank you, Denise. So as you continue with your research project, it is going to grow and it's going to change, which is what should happen if you are paying attention and learning. But at its core, there really needs to be a question or a problem that is going to keep you centered through the long haul. So what it comes down to is, what do you actually want to know, right? So how you go about answering that question may change. The field site, maybe the methods, maybe some of the sources or ways of getting at it. But the fundamental question that drives the research needs to be solid, and you need to care. So in my own experience, I am a sociocultural anthropologist. My field is that of food, agriculture, and labor. And for my dissertation, I started off wanting to know if the roles of immigrants as vendors in Italy's urban food markets made any difference in the way that local Italians perceived immigrants as community members. So I spent a summer interviewing people and making observations at one of these big markets. But in my interviews with vendors and with shoppers and organizers, it became clear that people, they weren't that interested, honestly, in who sold their food, but they really cared who made their food. And so I relocated the project to rural sites of agricultural production, which were also staffed by immigrant employees, and instead examined the relationships that were formed between immigrants and the community that relied on them. So on the surface, it looked like a very different project than the one I came in with. It had a different field site, a different set of history and literature I needed to dig into. But at the core, the question driving it remained the same, right? So this is all to say that if you really have a question that you care about, and you find yourself hitting some dead ends or silences, pay attention to those, because those are data. Rather than just discarding them as wasted time, right? Whether that's, well, why won't people talk about this? Or why is what I see as important not really important to my research subjects? What questions just aren't working in my interviews? Which ones are more productive? Or if there are big gaps in the archives or an absence of data and wherever you're looking, don't discard that or walk away from it immediately. Think about why. And so this is a fine line, right? Because you don't want to spend months just digging a rabbit hole that is going nowhere but down. But you shouldn't abandon your research question just because it doesn't end up taking you exactly where you thought it would at the outset. If you are clear about what drives your research, and you pay attention to the data rather than forcing it into the box that you set out with, you will have a project. And that's all I have to say about that.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. So we're going to build bridges now with each other. And I called this slide Building Bridges, and also in parentheses, Staying with the Trouble, which is actually a reference to a Donna Haraway book that's called Staying with the Trouble. And it's about climate change, and it's about staying with the trouble, which means understanding that things can go awry, and figuring out the ways in which we can continue to coexist with each other and with the process that we're undergoing, recognizing both that we have some agency and that also we're in a larger sort of historical, biological process that we can't at this point fully transform or stop. So what we're going to ask you to do is to fill out a piece of paper or to use a piece of paper to answer 3 questions or to make 3 points. And we want you to make this as brief as possible. So don't feel like you have to write a paragraph. Probably just 1 or 2 sentences is enough. And so what you're going to say is, I am studying X. So in my case, I would say, I am studying the experiences of New Yorkers with the pandemic. Then the second point is because I want to find out why. And in my case, it would be because I want to find out the ways in which social networks are activated for survival in different kinds of communities. And then finally, in order to help the reader understand Z, which in my case would be in order to help the reader understand the ways in which community is important to individual experiences, right? So that's, I've given you my example. You can all think of your own examples. Once you've done that and you're going to be in breakout rooms with 3 people in each breakout room, it would be great if you would just share with each other what you've written down and to try to find connections between your different projects. And this might not be an easy thing to do necessarily, but I think that it'll be possible pretty much in every case to build some sort of a bridge between 2 projects, which will help you also understand different ways of approaching your own work. So I think that Rachel is going to put you
I'm going to
into,
put you all in breakout rooms right now. Here we go.
and you have 7 minutes to do this. So it's a bit tight, but I think still worth it.
Great. Welcome back.
Do we have most people back?
Mhm.
Yeah, everybody's back now.
Everyone's back.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Welcome back, everyone. And I hope that you had brief but productive exchanges with each other. We're now ready to do a question and answer period with you. We decided to share this comic strip with you because I think it reflects the experience that many of us have. A person who is almost done writing their paper and the professor says, "What do you still need to do?" And the student says, "I just need to find a fitting research topic." And this is not to say that this student started out with no question and no research topic. It's quite possible, and I'm 99% sure that all of you will start with a very clear research topic and question, but it's basically to say your topic and your question is going to transform through the research process itself. And you might not know until the end of your process exactly what it is that you were asking. And that's completely normal. And it actually reflects the fact that you are a person that's open to the world that you're exploring. The last thing you want is to ask a question that you think you know the answer to and to find exactly that answer to the question that you were asking. It's something that's also called a just so story. If you want to put it in Rudyard Kipling's terms. So yeah, I think with that, I'm just going to open it up for questions